The story says that they were in the wilderness for 40 years, Moses and the people. By way of reference, 40 years is a dozen years longer than the Berlin Wall stood. The Berlin Wall construction began in August of 1961, and famously it was torn down in November of 1989. And I wonder if, for the people who wandered in the wilderness, if the wilderness felt a bit like the wall, if it felt like something that was going to stand forever. In September, even on November 1st of 1989, we thought the wall was going to stand forever. We thought that my children and grandchildren would visit it. If it was always going to be this thing that would keep them from getting where they wanted to go. Assuredly, there were people who were born in Egypt, escaped into the wilderness, and who died in the wilderness. And assuredly, there were people who were born in the wilderness and who died in the wilderness. So for them, the wilderness was everything. The wilderness was forever, how things have always been. And I wonder, because of that always, if there were people who looked at stories of Egypt and stories of the Promised Land, and they just felt like abstractions. The one feeling like ancient history, and the Promised Land feeling like fantasy. These are stories told by old people and by dreamers, respectively. Maybe when Moses talks about the Promised Land, there are actually people among the Israelites who roll their eyes. And then suddenly, after 40 years, they're here. They're here on the shore of the Jordan. They're looking across at the Promised Land, and it's real. The story they were told, it's actually happening. What do they feel in this moment? Given how long it took, how much it felt like forever, disbelief is probably one of the things they feel in this moment. Like that, oh man, that thing they said, that's actually happening. There's jubilation, I imagine, high-fiving and hugging and running around the bonfire, rock and roll all night and party every day, right? This sort of, this delight. But I wonder as well if there is sadness in this moment. There's an ending in crossing over the Jordan and into the Promised Land, and endings always bring sadness with them. I wonder if some of the Israelites are sad because the wilderness provided an important story or explanation for them. The wilderness was the reason that they were stuck, that they couldn't get on with their lives. Sometimes when there is an alcoholic in your life, a drunk father or brother or close friend, that person becomes almost all-consuming. They become this gravitational force that you orbit around, and they are the reason that you can't go away to school, that you can't get married, that you can't take a risk. They are the reason that your life is full of drama, 911 calls and conversations full of shame and excuses and chaos and excitement. And they're also the reason as well that you have someone to compare yourself to and say, I'm doing pretty well with my life. Compared to my brother, compared to dad, my life is doing pretty good. And sometimes it's enormously destabilizing when that drunk gets sober. Like, oh, wow, I actually don't know what to do without this person fulfilling this role. I wonder if the end of the wilderness for some of the Israelites is like that. They wanted it to end, and it's still sad and a shock when it does. Maybe there's another reason for sadness on this day, and that is for 40 years, the wilderness was the Israelites' purpose, and in particular, escaping the wilderness was the Israelites' purpose. They got up in the morning and said, we're going to get out of the wilderness. And they walked and they planned and they prayed and they did all these things. There are World War II veterans, most of them gone to their reward now, who came home and after having this intense, immensely purposeful experience, really young in their lives. Many of those veterans were 18 years old when they went to war. Everything thereafter felt like marking time. It felt like it was just post-log. It was anticlimax after this immense struggle that they'd been part of. Again, they wanted it to end, but there is this sadness in the purpose concluding. I think something similar can happen with caregivers. If you've been caring for months or years for a dying loved one, and at last you get them safely into the arms of death, there can be, after the funeral, when all the rush ends, this moment of what now? Who am I now that I don't have this great purpose? And maybe that is part of the sadness that the Israelites hold on this day. Or maybe there's just sadness because in spite of everything, the wilderness is beautiful. It's the place you want to escape, but it's still glorious. It's this place full of possibility. It was in the wilderness that the Israelites met God in flaming bushes, in pillars of cloud, in manna that fell from the heavens. Even if it tasted the same every day, God was still in it. There's something beautiful about wilderness places. Again, consider the Berlin Wall. It was the scar on the city, but in a strange way, it was also glorious. It was like some kind of art installation running down the middle of streets, like this snake strangely snaking its way between buildings. On one side of it, there was literal art painted. I think Keith Haring painted on a section of the wall. In the other side, on the east side, there was this strange starkness, which in its own way was beautiful. And the people of Berlin could not wait to tear it down. And when you visit Berlin today, there's a golden line that runs where the wall used to be. In a funny way, this thing that they couldn't wait to get rid of was beautiful, and in a funny way, they mourn its absence. And what about Moses himself? What is he holding on this day? Moses, the text says, is 120 years old when they make it to the Jordan, but his vigor is unabated, his eyesight is unabated. He is what the researchers call a super-ager. Maybe it is because of all of the hiking that he's been doing, but he is in fantastic shape. But even though he is 120 years old and in fantastic shape, the Lord has said he's going to die. Moses is not going to enter into the promised land. So for him, there is this intense intersection, we can imagine, of jubilation and sadness in one place. This is his life's goal, to get the people to this moment, and he's not going to cross the Jordan with him, with the people. Moses is like the gardener. I don't know if you've ever visited one of those European gardens and heard the lore that a gardener planted a seed for a tree and knew that it would grow to bring perfect balance into the garden, and then it would leave perfect shade in the garden. And the gardener knew as well that they would not live to see that tree reach its full, I was going to say flowering, but that's not quite what trees do. Its full size, its full potential. Moses is like that. He's planted something in the people of Israel, and he is not going to see its fruition. It's beautiful and sad at the same time. Throughout their time in the wilderness, Moses has spoken on God's behalf. So Moses has gone up the mountain. He's come back with his face shining. He has encountered the burning bush. God has told Moses what to say on God's behalf. They've spoken, and God has said to Moses, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you trippingly on the tongue." And Moses has come down and done that for the people. And on this day, at the end of their wanderings, Moses speaks to the people once more on God's behalf, and says, I set before you life and death. I set before you blessings and curses. I set before you God and other gods. Choose life, choose blessings, choose God. And maybe this choice that Moses offers to the people, that God offers to the people, is the choice that we're always faced when we come to the end of the wilderness and we're looking across the Jordan at the promised land. We're always choosing between blessing and curse, between life and death, between God and other gods. This is certainly the choice that Jesus faces in the wilderness, isn't it? The tempter comes to him and says, you look hungry, why don't you turn stone into bread? And this is a thing maybe we're tempted to do in the wilderness. There are berries that look like they might fill our tummies. There are rivers that it looks like that we might drink from, but in fact those are contaminated by what's happening upstream. There is this danger in consuming the wrong thing that the tempter has offered to us in the wilderness. The tempter says, why don't you jump off this great height, and the angels are going to catch you. And maybe that's a temptation we have in the wilderness as well. I don't know if you've had the experience of being hiking and being overwhelmed by the grandeur of creation and sort of imagining for a moment that you sort of have superpowers or the laws of reality don't apply to you. I've briefly wondered if I could fly off a cliff. Thankfully, I've put those thoughts to a stop, relatively quickly, but they are thoughts that occur. And maybe in the baldest choice between God and other gods, the tempter says, why don't you bow down before me? Why don't you worship me, and I'm going to give you everything. These choices between life and death, blessing and curses, God and other gods, maybe seem obvious sitting in pews. But in the wilderness, where those berries show up and they look so tasty, where the stream looks like it will slake our thirst, where there are mirages, it can be hard to know which choice is God and which is other gods. All of the time, we are invited to choose between God and the gods in our wallet, in our phone, in our jobs. The list goes on of things that are not God. And so Moses orders the people, begs the people, choose life, choose blessing, choose God. And then Moses waits, and God waits, and heaven and earth themselves witness the waiting. The wait to see what you and I will choose here at the edge of the wilderness.